Ebony crouched on the cold marble floor, her heart pounding so loud she thought it might burst from her chest. The angry voice above her echoed against the tiled walls. She could still feel the sting of his words. He called her filth and said she did not belong here. He glared at her with a look that told her she was less than nothing. She kept her gaze down, eyes fixed on a stray drop of water near her shoe. Her chest felt tight as she tried to hold back tears. She wished she could disappear. The tall, older man towered over her, jabbing his finger in the air. She never thought a simple mistake could lead to such rage, but here she was, trembling, too scared to speak. She wanted to explain, to say she was only doing her job. She wanted to say she did not see the sign, that she had no intention of crossing boundaries. Yet no words would come. His voice got louder, and Ebony clenched her fist to stop her hands from shaking. She knew she had to keep quiet. One wrong word would make this worse. She stole a quick glance at the door, thinking of escape, but it felt too far away. In that moment, she was sure no one would help her. No one would come to her rescue. She was alone in this giant house, with only scorn pressing down on her. Ebony swallowed hard, remembering every warning she had ever heard. Stay in your place. Know your limits. Do not talk back. Those words rang in her ears like a harsh reminder that she was in a world where her voice could mean trouble. She wanted nothing more than to stand up for herself. But fear held her down, pinned her to that cold floor, and told her not to risk it. The older man's face was twisted with rage. She could see the lines on his forehead, the tightness in his jaw. He looked at her like she was a stain on the perfect white tile. If she could shrink, she would have. She felt worthless and small. Later that night, Ebony sat alone in her tiny bedroom in the servants' quarters. She could not stop shaking. The scene replayed in her mind. She had only started this job a few weeks ago, cleaning rooms and shining floors in the sprawling estate of the famous millionaire, Nicholas Holmes. She was used to working in big houses, but never one so grand. She had grown up in a modest neighborhood where most people struggled to pay rent, but she always found jobs in local homes. This, however, was a different world. The house had 30 rooms, a garden that looked like a park, and a staff of 15 people for cooking, cleaning, and other tasks. At first, Ebony felt grateful for the chance to earn a steady wage. It was her best-paying job ever, but she did not expect the silent stares or the snide remarks. She did not expect the tension that followed her whenever she walked through certain hallways. She remembered how she had gotten lost that morning. The house was like a maze, with corridors branching off in all directions. She was told to clean the guest wing bathrooms, so she carried her supplies and tried to navigate the long hallways. The carpets were so thick that her footsteps made no sound. She saw so many doors, each one looking the same, each handle made of shining gold-colored metal. She opened one door thinking it led to another guest room. Instead, she found herself in a private bathroom. Steamy air hit her face, and she realized too late that someone was inside. Nicholas Holmes stood there, half covered with a towel around his waist. His hair was wet, and droplets of water slid down his broad shoulders. Ebony froze. She felt her face heat up with embarrassment. She had never seen a man like him so close. His eyes locked on hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. She could not think straight. All she saw was his bare chest and the shock on his face. She tried to turn around, but her feet felt glued to the marble floor. She wanted to say something, to apologize, but the words got stuck in her throat. Then, before she could do anything, she took a step back and slipped. Her heel caught on the edge of the marble step, and she went crashing down. The bucket of cleaning supplies toppled over, spraying soap and sponges everywhere. Ebony hit the floor with a thud, and pain shot through her hip. Nicholas leaped forward, grabbing her arm to help steady her. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. She felt more embarrassed than hurt. Her mind raced with fear. She worried about how he might react. She expected him to yell or call her clumsy. She expected him to scold her for coming in without knocking. But Nicholas did none of those things. Instead, he crouched beside her, his expression filled with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, still holding her arm. Ebony tried to answer, but her voice was shaky. She gave a small nod, still speechless from the awkwardness of the moment. Nicholas stood and held out his hand to help her up. She took it, feeling the warmth of his palm. She remembered how tall he was, how his presence seemed to fill the room. Thank you for joining me on this journey through love and romance. If these stories warm your heart or spark your imagination, share your thoughts in the comments. I can't wait to hear what you think. And if you'd like to continue exploring more heartfelt tales, don't forget to subscribe. Your support keeps the love flowing. Even though he was only wearing a towel, he carried himself with dignity. Ebony felt her heart pound as she got to her feet. "I'm so sorry," she finally managed to say. "I got lost and—" "It's all right," Nicholas said, raising a hand to stop her from apologizing more. "These hallways can be confusing, and the door isn't labeled well." Ebony felt a wave of relief. He did not seem angry at all. He looked more worried about her well-being than about his own privacy. She quickly gathered her dropped items, cheeks flaming. She tried to keep her eyes down, but in her peripheral vision, she could still see him standing there, half naked, watching her with a gentle concern. She mumbled another apology and shuffled backward, nearly tripping again as she tried to exit. Nicholas stepped forward to catch her once more, but she managed to steady herself in time. She ran out of the bathroom and hurried down the hall, her heart still racing. In her rush, she almost collided with Mrs. Harding, the head housekeeper, who stood there with a stern look on her face. Ebony felt her stomach drop. She knew how strict Mrs. Harding was. The woman's gaze flicked from Ebony's soaked shirt to the spilled soap trailing after her. Ebony braced herself for a scolding. "What are you doing here?" Mrs. Harding asked, her voice stiff. Ebony tried to explain. "I was told to clean the guest bathroom, and I must have opened the wrong door. Mr. Holmes I didn't realize." She stammered, her face hot with shame. Before she could finish, a second voice joined them. "Mrs. Harding, it's all right," Nicholas said, stepping out of the bathroom. He had put on a robe by then. "She didn't do anything wrong. The door should be labeled better. It was my fault for not locking it." Mrs. Harding's expression softened just a bit, but her tone stayed cold. "This is not the guest wing, Ebony. This is Mr. Holmes's private suite. You should have known better." "I'm really sorry," Ebony repeated, bowing her head. She could sense Nicholas's eyes on her. She felt a strange mixture of gratitude and nervousness. She wondered if he thought she was incompetent or nosy. Mrs. Harding dismissed her with a curt nod. Ebony left quickly, feeling her heart still pound in her chest. She made her way back to the servants' area, found the supply closet, and sat on a small stool, trying to calm down. She had never felt so embarrassed. And yet a small part of her was glad Nicholas had been kind. Maybe he was different from others in his world. Maybe he was not the type to shout or demean. She pushed the thought away and focused on cleaning up. She had work to do. That night, however, Ebony's relief vanished when she encountered Nicholas's father, Harrison Holmes. He was the older man who had shouted at her and made her feel smaller than an insect on that cold floor. She did not know who he was at first, but she soon learned that he was the true owner of the estate, or at least the man who controlled everything behind the scenes. Nicholas was the public face of the family's wealth, but Harrison pulled the strings, and his power was known throughout the city. Ebony had been carrying a tray of water glasses through the hallway. She had just finished helping with a small party in the lounge. Music and laughter had filled the air, and the night seemed pleasant. Then, without warning, Ebony felt someone grab her arm from behind. She turned to see Harrison Holmes, dressed in a fine suit, his white hair neatly combed back. He had a sour expression on his face. "Who let you in here?" he snapped, looking at her uniform as though it offended him. Ebony tried to stay calm. "I'm one of the maids, sir. I was just—" His eyes narrowed. "I know who you are. I've seen you around. You think you can just wander wherever you want?" His tone dripped with contempt, and Ebony felt a chill run down her spine. She shook her head, not sure how to respond. Before she could say more, Harrison pulled her closer and whispered, "You stay away from my son. Do you hear me? Don't get any ideas. People like you do not belong in our world." Ebony's chest tightened. She was too stunned to speak. Harrison let go of her arm, leaving her standing there, shaken. She could only watch as he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Her heart hammered as she tried to understand what had just happened. "People like you," he had said. She knew exactly what he meant. She had seen that look before, the one that told her skin color and status made her a target for hatred. In the days that followed, Ebony tried her best to avoid crossing paths with Harrison. She stuck to her cleaning schedule, moving through the rooms with quiet efficiency. She woke up early to mop the floors, dust the antique furniture, and polish the silver. She helped in the kitchen when needed, washing vegetables or drying dishes. The pay was better than any job she had before, and she did not want to lose it. She needed to send money back home to her mother, who was sick and needed medicine. But Ebony could not stop thinking about Nicholas. She still felt a jolt of heat in her cheeks whenever she remembered the bathroom incident. Sometimes she would see him in the hallway, wearing a sharp suit, talking on his phone, or she would catch a glimpse of him on the terrace, drinking coffee and reading the news. Each time, her heart would flutter, and she could not explain why. She told herself it was just admiration or curiosity, but a part of her suspected it was something more. She also noticed that Nicholas began to greet her whenever he saw her. He would nod and offer a small smile. Once he even said, "Hope you're doing well," as he passed. It was a simple gesture, but it made Ebony's day. She felt warmth spread in her chest, and it reminded her that not everyone in the house treated her like furniture. Then there were the times she glimpsed Harrison glaring at her from across a room. She never held his gaze for long. She would quickly busy herself with her chores, feeling the weight of his silent hostility. She feared what might happen if she attracted too much attention. Yet, she could not deny that her eyes still followed Nicholas whenever he walked by. A battle raged inside her. She knew it was foolish to have feelings for someone so far out of her league, someone whose world was full of wealth and influence. It made no sense for a maid to think about a millionaire that way. And yet, her heart did not obey logic. One late afternoon, Ebony was cleaning the library, a grand room with high ceilings and shelves filled with old books. She loved being there, surrounded by the smell of paper and leather covers. She moved quietly, dusting each shelf and rearranging any books out of place. It was peaceful work. The sunlight came through tall windows, creating a warm glow on the polished floor. She thought she was alone, so she hummed a soft tune while she worked. Then she heard footsteps. Startled, she turned around to see Nicholas standing in the doorway. He had no tie on, and his jacket was slung over his arm. He looked tired, but managed a gentle smile. "I'm sorry," he said, noticing her surprise. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I just needed a quiet place to think." Ebony stood there, cloth in hand. She felt a flush in her cheeks. "You're not interrupting, sir," she said politely. She set down the duster. "I can come back later if you need the room." Nicholas shook his head. "No, please stay. It's your job to be here. I won't disturb you." He walked past her to a window seat and sank down, resting his head against the glass. Ebony watched him for a moment, unsure if she should carry on or leave him in peace. After a few moments of silence, Nicholas spoke again. "I'm guessing you're new here. I haven't seen you around until recently." Ebony nodded. "Yes, sir. I started a few weeks ago." Nicholas turned, meeting her eyes. "And how do you like it so far?" She thought about the question. She remembered Harrison's glare and the tension she felt in certain corners of the house. But she also remembered the steady paycheck and the relief of having money to send home. "It's different," she said carefully. "A big change from what I'm used to. But I'm grateful for the work." Nicholas seemed to understand the hidden meaning. He gave a slight nod. "This house can be overwhelming," he said, "and not everyone here is understanding." Ebony did not know how to respond, so she just lowered her gaze. She had the sense that Nicholas was trying to be kind, but she feared reading too much into his words. As the weeks passed, Ebony found herself drawn more and more to Nicholas. She tried to hide it, telling herself it was just a harmless crush. She admired how he treated the staff with respect. He would often smile or say hello, even to those whom many rich people would ignore. He did not seem to think he was above everyone else. She saw him thank the chef personally for meals, or help an older gardener carry heavy bags of mulch. Small acts of kindness like these made Ebony see a side of Nicholas that was different from his father. But she also saw the subtle ways racism played out in the house. Some of the other maids, who looked more like Ebony, complained in hushed tones about being asked to use the back stairs, or receiving smaller tips from guests who did not bother to learn their names. Ebony heard certain staff refer to her as "that black girl" when they thought she was not listening. She found insulting notes left in the laundry room telling her to know her place. Each time, she felt anger stir inside, but she could not risk losing her job by causing conflict. One day, she was polishing the mirrors in the grand foyer when she heard laughter coming from a nearby room. She recognized Harrison's voice and that of some guests. She tried to keep her distance, but the door was slightly ajar. She could not help but overhear. "I don't see why my son insists on being so friendly with the help," Harrison was saying. His tone was mocking. "He acts like they're his friends. It's embarrassing." A gruff voice responded, "The younger generation is soft. They think everyone should be treated equally." Ebony's stomach twisted. She clutched her cloth tighter, trying not to make a sound. Part of her wanted to storm in and speak her mind. Another part of her wanted to run away and never come back. She hated feeling like she was invisible, reduced to a stereotype or a nuisance. Yet she stood still, letting their words sink in. That night, she cried in her small room. She pressed her face into her pillow, muffling the sound of her sobs. She thought about quitting, but she remembered her mother's hospital bills. She had no choice but to stay. Her mood only lifted a few days later when Nicholas approached her in the hallway with a warm smile. "Ebony," he said, surprising her by using her name. She did not even realize he knew it. I wanted to ask if everything was going okay. I've noticed you seem a bit quiet lately. Ebony felt her heart flutter. She tried to stay calm. I'm all right, sir, she said. Just been busy with work. Nicholas looked at her with genuine concern. You can talk to me if something's bothering you. I know my father can be difficult. Ebony was taken aback by his honesty. She wanted to tell him everything, how Harrison's words made her feel, how the staff sometimes treated her, and how she felt torn inside. But she was scared. She barely knew Nicholas. What if this was a trap? What if he was only pretending to care? She reminded herself that he was the employer's son, living in a world she did not understand. So instead, Ebony just forced a small smile. Thank you, sir, she said quietly. But I'll be fine. Nicholas hesitated for a moment, then nodded. All right, he said gently. If you ever need anything, let me know. Ebony watched as he walked away, his footsteps echoing down the polished floor. She sighed, feeling a mix of gratitude and sadness. She wondered what it would be like if they could talk openly, if she could share her story without fear. She imagined a world where their differences did not matter. But reality pressed on her like a heavy weight, reminding her that such a world did not exist in this house. One late evening, Ebony was asked to stay longer to help prepare the dining hall for a big event the next day. She worked hard, arranging centerpieces and ensuring the crystal glasses were spotless. By the time she finished, it was past midnight. She walked through the dimly lit corridor, heading toward the servants' wing. Her back ached from bending over all day, and her eyes felt heavy. She just wanted to collapse into bed. As she reached the old wooden staircase leading to her room, she heard a low voice. Ebony. She jumped, clutching her chest. Nicholas stood at the bottom of the stairs, wearing a casual sweater and jeans. He had a file in his hand and looked like he had been working late too. Oh, you startled me, Ebony said, her voice shaky. I'm sorry, Nicholas said quickly. I didn't mean to scare you. I just wanted to catch you before you went to sleep. She eyed him curiously, noticing the serious expression on his face. Is everything okay? He shifted on his feet, looking nervous. Yes, sort of. I wanted to ask for your help with something. Ebony tilted her head. My help? Nicholas nodded. I have an important meeting in a few days. It's about a charity event. I've been trying to focus on philanthropic projects, but I need someone who can give me honest feedback on how these events affect people who aren't wealthy. I thought maybe you could share your thoughts. Ebony's eyes widened. She had never been asked for her opinion by someone like Nicholas. She felt a mixture of excitement and dread. I'm not sure I'd be of much help, she said, her voice trembling. I'm just a maid. Nicholas took a step closer, lowering his voice. You're not just anything, he said. I want to know how these programs might help families like yours. It matters. His words touched something deep inside her. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Okay, she said. I'll do my best. He smiled, relief washing over his face. Thank you. Maybe we can talk tomorrow? After your shift? Ebony nodded again. She watched as Nicholas walked away, and she felt a strange spark of hope in her chest. Maybe he really did care. Maybe he saw her as a person worth listening to. That thought helped her sleep better than she had in weeks. True to his word, Nicholas found her the next afternoon and asked if she could spare a little time after work. Ebony had finished her chores for the day, so she agreed. They met in a small study room near the library. Nicholas had a stack of papers spread out on a large mahogany desk. Ebony felt nervous stepping into the space. She had never been invited to use one of the private rooms like this. Come in, Nicholas said, gesturing to a chair across from him. She sat down timidly, her hands clasped in her lap. He started asking her about her background, where she grew up, what her mother did for a living, how she found jobs. At first, Ebony answered in short sentences. She was wary of sharing too much. But the more Nicholas listened, the more she relaxed. He seemed genuinely interested, nodding and scribbling notes on a pad. Finally, he asked about what struggles she faced daily. Ebony felt a lump in her throat. She talked about her mother's illness, the expensive medication, and how she could not always afford it. She mentioned how she sometimes had to choose between paying the rent or buying groceries. Nicholas asked questions about local charities or government programs, but Ebony told him those rarely helped people in her neighborhood. They were often underfunded, or the application processes were too complicated. Nicholas shook his head, looking upset. I had no idea it was like this, he admitted. When I read about these programs, they sound so promising. But if they don't actually reach the people who need them, what's the point? Ebony shrugged. Some people in power only want good publicity. They launch a program, take pictures, but don't follow up. Nicholas leaned back in his chair, letting out a sigh. That's exactly what I don't want to do, he said. I want to make sure the help is real, not just talk. It seems I have a lot to learn. Ebony watched him, feeling a rush of sympathy. She sensed that he was sincere, and that made her want to help him even more. She offered him a few ideas, like working with local community centers or speaking directly to families in need. Nicholas jotted everything down with serious attention. By the end, they both realized hours had passed. The sky outside was dark, and Ebony's stomach growled from hunger. Nicholas stood up. I'm sorry, I kept you so long, he said. Let me at least order dinner for you. Ebony started to refuse, not wanting to be a bother, but Nicholas insisted. He called the kitchen and had them prepare a simple meal for two. They ate together in that small study, the atmosphere surprisingly relaxed. Ebony felt a warmth spreading through her. It was the first time she had shared a meal like this with anyone from the household who was not a fellow maid. Over the next few days, Nicholas and Ebony held more such meetings. Sometimes they were short, just a few minutes of conversation in a quiet corner. Other times, they were longer discussions in the study, with Ebony explaining more about the challenges faced by the people in her community. Nicholas began using her insights to shape the charity proposals he was working on. He invited her to look over documents, and even asked for her opinions on certain budget plans, though Ebony insisted she did not have the expertise. Still, he valued her thoughts. During these sessions, they grew closer. Ebony found herself smiling more, feeling comfortable around him. Nicholas also opened up about his own struggles. He talked about how he and his father disagreed on many issues, including charity work and business deals. He confessed that he felt trapped by expectations, always under pressure to keep the family name flawless. Ebony listened quietly, giving him the empathy he rarely found in others. Each time they parted ways, Ebony felt a strange flutter in her chest. She knew she was stepping into dangerous territory. If Harrison or Mrs. Harding found out how much time she was spending with Nicholas, it could lead to trouble. Rumors might among the staff. She also worried about Nicholas's reputation. She did not want to cause any friction in the house, especially since she needed this job. But despite her worries, she could not seem to pull away. And Nicholas seemed equally drawn to her. He asked her once if she minded his company. When she said no, he gave a soft laugh and said, "Good, because I enjoy talking to you. You help me see the world differently." Those words made Ebony's heart soar. She knew it was naive to think something could blossom between them. But for a moment, she allowed herself to imagine. She pictured walking by his side without worrying about stares or hateful remarks. She imagined introducing him to her mother and showing him her old neighborhood. Then reality would come crashing back, reminding her of all the barriers between them. She would push the fantasy aside and focus on the present. One evening, Ebony was asked to bring fresh towels to the sauna area on the other side of the mansion. The hallway there was dark, and most of the guests had gone to bed. She carried a neat stack of towels and wore slippers to keep silent on the floor. As she turned a corner, she nearly bumped into Nicholas, who was coming from the opposite direction. They both stopped, startled. "Oh, hi," he said softly, taking in the sight of the towels in her arms. "Working late again?" Ebony nodded, smiling. "Yes, just delivering these. I didn't realize you'd still be up." He shrugged, looking down the empty hallway. "I couldn't sleep. I was walking around, thinking." He hesitated, then added, "Hey, there's something I want to show you. If you have a moment." Ebony's curiosity piqued. She glanced at her watch. She was almost done for the day. She nodded. "All right." Nicholas guided her to a small side door she had never noticed before. Beyond it was a spiral staircase, leading up. He led her to a hidden balcony that overlooked the estate gardens. The night sky was clear, and the moonlight made the flowers and hedges glow with a gentle light. Ebony gasped at the view. She had never seen the gardens from this angle. It looked magical, like a scene from a fairy tale. "I come here sometimes to think," Nicholas said, resting his arms on the railing. "No one else seems to know about it. Or if they do, they never use it." Ebony placed the towels on a nearby bench and joined him at the railing. The cool night air brushed against her face. She felt a sense of peace she rarely experienced in this mansion. They stood there quietly for a few moments, just taking in the view. Then Nicholas spoke in a hushed tone. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to break free from all this. To just live a normal life, away from the pressures of my family's name." Ebony looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. I guess we all dream about escaping something, she said. But normal life isn't always easy either. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with an emotion she could not quite read. I know, he said, but you've shown me a side of life I never really understood. I'm grateful for that. Ebony felt her heart pound. She glanced at his hand resting on the railing, inches from hers. The moment felt charged, as if something was about to happen. But then a cold wind blew, and she remembered where she was, who she was. She quickly stepped back. I should get these towels delivered, she murmured. Nicholas nodded, looking a little disappointed. Right, of course. As she gathered the towels and left, she could still feel the warmth of his presence. It lingered with her through the rest of the night. But their growing closeness did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, Ebony was finishing up polishing a grand banister when Mrs. Harding appeared, her face as tight as usual. She beckoned Ebony over. I've heard rumors, Mrs. Harding said in a low voice, that you've been spending time alone with Mr. Nicholas. Is that true? Ebony's hands trembled around the polishing cloth. She thought about lying, but she could see from Mrs. Harding's gaze that the woman already knew. Yes, ma'am, she said quietly. He asked for my help with his charity plans. Mrs. Harding pursed her lips. I hope you understand this is highly irregular. The staff are not meant to fraternize with the family in that manner. Ebony swallowed. We've just been talking, she said, nothing more. Mrs. Harding studied her face for a long moment. Then she sighed, her tone softening slightly. Be careful, Ebony. Mr. Holmes, the elder Mr. Holmes, will not like this, and he can be cruel when angered. Ebony nodded, feeling a ball of dread settle in her stomach. She thanked Mrs. Harding and returned to her tasks, her mind racing. She had known this moment would come, she just did not expect it so soon. If Mrs. Harding knew, then others might too. And if Harrison Holmes heard about it, Ebony's worst fears would come true. That fear became reality only days later. Ebony was busy in the laundry room when she heard the sound of an argument in the hallway. She recognized Harrison's deep, booming voice. She heard Nicholas's calmer tone, which grew louder as he tried to reason with his father. Ebony's chest tightened. She could not make out the exact words, but she sensed it was about her. Before she could hide, the door burst open and Harrison Holmes stormed in, Nicholas right behind him. Harrison's face was red with anger, and he pointed a finger at Ebony. There she is, he spat. Don't deny it, Nicholas. You're spending your time with this girl. I won't have it. Ebony's heart pounded as she watched Nicholas step forward, placing himself between his father and her. Father, stop, Nicholas said firmly. You're making assumptions. Am I? Harrison said with a sneer. I've seen the way you look at her. I've heard the whispers, and I will not allow any scandal in this house. Ebony stood frozen, wishing she could vanish. She felt small again, like she had on that cold bathroom floor. She waited for Nicholas to deny everything to protect himself. But he surprised her. Father, I'm not ashamed of anything, Nicholas said, his voice steady. Ebony is helping me understand real problems. I respect her, and you should too. If there's a scandal here, it's only because of your narrow views. Harrison's face grew even darker. You dare talk to me like that over some maid? He turned his glare on Ebony. Pack your things, he snapped at her. You're fired. Time seemed to slow. Ebony felt a blow to her chest, like she could not breathe. She had guessed this might happen, but hearing it stated so plainly was still a shock. Her job was her lifeline, the only way she could pay for her mother's medicine. She opened her mouth to plead, but no sound came out. Nicholas stepped closer to his father, rage in his eyes. You can't do this, he said through clenched teeth. She hasn't done anything wrong. Harrison let out a bitter laugh. This is my house. I can do what I please. If you want to waste your time on charity cases, do it outside these walls. I won't have this nonsense under my own roof. Nicholas turned to Ebony, pain in his gaze. For a moment, Ebony feared that he might step aside, surrendering to his father's will. But then Nicholas took Ebony's hand and faced Harrison again. Then I'll leave too, he said, his voice resolute. Harrison's eyes bulged. Don't be ridiculous. You're my son. This is your heritage. Where will you go? Nicholas did not waver. Anywhere but here, he said. If this is the price of your approval, I don't want it. A shocked hush fell over the laundry room. Ebony's hand shook in Nicholas's grasp. She could not believe what she was hearing. Was Nicholas really willing to defy his father for her? She opened her mouth to tell him he did not have to do this. She did not want to ruin his life. But Nicholas tightened his grip. as if telling her to trust him. Harrison's face turned an ugly shade of purple. "If you walk out of here with that girl, don't ever expect to come back," he snarled. Nicholas gave a sad smile. "You made that choice, not me," he said quietly. "I love you, Father, but I can't live with your hate. This has gone on too long." Ebony's heart hammered at his words. "I can't live with your hate." She realized Nicholas was not just fighting for her, but for the principle of dignity and respect. For a moment, she felt a surge of hope, tempered by fear. Could they really walk away from this mansion, from this life, and start over somewhere else? She found her voice at last. "Nicholas, you don't have to do this," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "I don't want you to lose everything." Nicholas turned to her, the corners of his mouth lifting in a gentle smile. "You help me see what truly matters," he said. "I'm not losing anything that I want to keep." Harrison made a strangled sound of fury. "Go then," he shouted, throwing his arm toward the door. "Both of you. Don't come crawling back when this foolishness destroys you." Nicholas sighed, looking heartbroken at his father's anger. But he did not step back. He led Ebony out of the laundry room, down the hall, and to the front entrance of the mansion. Ebony's heart pounded with each step, her mind reeling. She felt the eyes of the staff on them, wide with shock. She could almost hear whispers trailing behind them like ghosts. When they reached the massive wooden doors, Nicholas paused. He turned to Ebony. "I need to grab a few things from my room," he said. "But I'm guessing we should get you out of here before my father changes the locks." Ebony nodded numbly, still in disbelief. Nicholas flagged down a small service car that the staff used for errands. He asked the driver, a kind older man named Thomas, if he would take Ebony somewhere safe. Thomas, who always had a gentle word for Ebony, nodded without hesitation. He seemed to understand the situation without needing an explanation. Nicholas turned to Ebony, cupping her face softly. His eyes shone with emotion. "Wait for me at the main gate," he said. "I'll be right behind you." Ebony felt tears slip down her cheeks as she nodded. She climbed into the passenger seat of the service car, and Thomas drove away. In the rearview mirror, she could see Nicholas standing on the driveway, watching her leave. Her heart felt heavy and relieved at the same time. They reached the gate, and Ebony stepped out, hugging her arms around herself. The evening air was cool, and she realized she had no coat. Thomas wordlessly handed her a blanket from the trunk. She muttered a thank you, trying to steady her thoughts. She had lost her job. She had nowhere to go. And yet, she was not alone. Nicholas had chosen to stand by her. It felt unreal. Minutes later, a second car roared up to the gate. Nicholas was at the wheel, a small suitcase in the back seat. He hopped out, his breath visible in the chilly night. He hurried to Ebony's side. "I'm sorry," he whispered, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Are you okay?" Ebony nodded, though her eyes were still brimming with tears. "I will be," she said softly. Thomas said a quiet goodbye and drove back toward the mansion, probably to face the wrath of Harrison. Ebony and Nicholas were left standing on the side of the road, the tall iron gates behind them. It was a strange, lonely feeling, watching the only real home Nicholas had ever known fade from view. For Ebony, it was also the loss of a much-needed income. Nicholas took her hands in his, gazing into her eyes. "I don't regret this," he said. "I meant what I said. I don't want to live in a house built on hate." Ebony felt overwhelmed. She wiped her cheeks, sniffling. "But what do we do now?" Nicholas looked at the road, stretching into the darkness. "We'll figure it out together," he said. His voice was firm, but she could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He was scared, too. They got into Nicholas's car and drove away, leaving the mansion behind. Ebony stared at the passing lights, her mind swirling with questions. Where would they stay? How would they pay for bills, rent, and her mother's medication? Was Nicholas truly prepared to give up his inheritance and lifestyle for her sake? The night seemed endless, full of fear and a strange sense of excitement. Over the next few days, they rented a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. It was far from the luxury Nicholas was used to, but he adapted quickly. He used his own savings to cover the rent for the moment. He apologized to Ebony for not having something nicer, but she laughed and told him he was lucky to have any savings at all. Slowly, they began to build a new life. Nicholas continued his charity work, determined to prove that he could stand on his own. He reached out to contacts who believed in him, and they partnered with him on projects that made a real difference. Ebony, meanwhile, found a part-time job cleaning offices, and though the pay was not much, it helped. Nicholas insisted on paying for her mother's medication until they could get her on a better healthcare plan. They faced challenges at every turn. Some people refused to associate with Nicholas once they learned he had angered his father. Others mocked their relationship, casting ugly remarks about a rich man stooping to a poor black maid. Ebony struggled with guilt, feeling as though she had robbed Nicholas of his family and fortune. But Nicholas always reassured her that he had chosen this path. He believed in equality, in compassion, and in their bond. Their shared struggles brought them closer. In the quiet evenings when Ebony came home from her office cleaning shift, she and Nicholas would cook a simple dinner together. They would laugh over small accidents in the kitchen or talk about the day's achievements and setbacks. Sometimes, Ebony would show him pictures of her mother, and he would promise to visit her soon. And, yes, they fell in love. It was not the fairy tale love of glitzy parties and fancy dances. It was a love built on trust and understanding, on shared dreams and mutual respect. It was a love that had been tested by hate and adversity. They talked about the future, about getting married someday. Nicholas said he did not need his father's blessing, but Ebony said it still mattered to her that they try to mend the family ties. Months later, Harrison Holmes called. Ebony was the one who answered the phone at the small apartment. She almost did not pick up, but Nicholas was out, and she felt a strange pull to face whatever this was. Harrison's voice was quieter than she remembered. He asked to speak with Nicholas. Ebony's heart pounded. She told him Nicholas was out but would call back. Harrison hesitated, then in a strained voice said, "Tell him I'm sorry." Then he hung up. When Nicholas returned, Ebony relayed the message. He stood there, stunned. Neither of them knew what it meant exactly. Was Harrison ready to accept them, or was it just regret at losing his son? Nicholas did call his father back. The conversation was short and awkward. There was no instant forgiveness or joyful reunion. But it was a start, a step toward healing. In time, Ebony saw that sometimes love does conquer hate not through grand gestures alone, but through the steady, patient choice to care for each other. She and Nicholas did not have all the answers. They still faced prejudice, from strangers and sometimes even from Harrison. But their bond grew stronger with every hurdle. And whenever Ebony remembered that dark moment in the bathroom, she could not help but smile at how a simple mistake had led her to the greatest gift, a partner who stood with her against all odds. They had discovered that the true measure of worth was not in wealth or status, but in kindness and integrity. In that sense, Nicholas was richer than he had ever been in that grand house. And Ebony, once just a maid in a millionaire's mansion, became the love who opened his eyes to a world beyond opulence, a world that was real, painful, beautiful, and worth every sacrifice. They had chosen each other, despite the walls society tried to build, and in that choice, they found a love deeper and more precious than any treasure the mansion could hold. Thank you for joining me on this journey through love and romance. If these stories warm your heart or spark your imagination, share your thoughts in the comments. I can't wait to hear what you think. And if you'd like to continue exploring more heartfelt tales, don't forget to subscribe. Your support keeps the love flowing.